In the autumn of 1882, while other Dakota homesteaders prepared for winter, Kevin Halleck did the unthinkable. He dammed the creek and flooded his wheat field under a sheet of black ice. The neighbors called it suicide. He drowned his only crop. But Kevin believed the ice would form armor against the fierce dry winds that killed wheat every February. If he was right, a record harvest. If he was wrong, his children would starve. Kevin Halleck was a 37-year-old homesteader who had already buried one child to the Dakota winters. His 160 acres sat on flat prairie where February winds came screaming down from Canada, so dry and so cold they could strip a field of winter wheat to black stubble overnight. Most farmers stacked rock walls or prayed for early snow. Kevin Halleck built a dam. His neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. What they didn't know was that Kevin hadn't invented this madness. He'd stolen it from farmers 2,000 miles away who grew a crop no one in Dakota had ever planted. To understand why a man would drown his own wheat field, you have to understand what winter wheat meant to a Dakota homesteader in the 1880s. It was the difference between a family eating into summer or starving by March. The wheat was planted in September, sprouted before the freeze, then went dormant beneath the snow. In spring, it woke up and grew like fury. But there was an enemy that killed winter wheat faster than any blizzard: the black wind, a dry, screaming gale that came off the Canadian Shield in February, so cold it didn't just freeze the stalks, it desiccated them, sucked the moisture straight out of the plant tissue until the field turned to brittle black straw, worthless, dead right there in the frozen ground. A single bad wind could wipe out 40 acres of wheat overnight. And in this part of Dakota Territory, the February wind came every year. Kevin Halleck knew this better than anyone. He'd spent 5 winters on that claim watching the wind strip neighbors' fields to nothing while his own wheat survived only because he'd buried it under heavy straw mulch. But mulch wasn't enough for a real blow. In the winter of 1881, the wind found every crack, every thin spot, and Kevin lost a third of his crop. That was the year his youngest daughter, Mary, caught fever in February and never saw spring. The doctor said it was the cold that weakened her. Kevin knew it was the wind that kept the cold inside the cabin. After that, something in him hardened. Years earlier, long before he filed his Dakota claim, Kevin had worked as a hired hand on a cranberry bog in Massachusetts. The cranberry growers there did something strange every December. After harvest, they opened floodgates and covered the entire bog under 2 feet of water. The water froze into a solid sheet of ice that stayed until March. Kevin had asked the bog foreman why. The answer stuck with him for a decade: ice armor. The ice didn't just protect the vines from cold. It shielded them from the winter wind that would otherwise dry them out and kill them. The vines slept safe beneath that frozen shield, woke up strong in spring. A cranberry bog could survive temperatures that would murder an unprotected field of anything else. And young Kevin Halleck had filed that fact away in the back of his mind, never knowing it would one day become the only card he had left to play. In the autumn of '82, Kevin stood at the edge of his wheat field and stared at the small creek that ran along its northern boundary. The wheat was healthy, green, standing 4 inches high in the cool September air. Any sensible farmer would be praying for a gentle winter with plenty of snow cover. Kevin was making a different calculation. Snow could be scoured away by the black wind in an hour. A sheet of ice couldn't. If he dammed that creek and flooded the field just after the wheat went dormant, the water would freeze into a solid slab of armor. The wind could scream all it wanted. It would scrape ice, not wheat. The idea was so reckless it felt like sin. Flood a field on purpose when every other homesteader was digging drainage ditches. But Kevin couldn't shake it. The cranberry growers had proved it worked. He spent the first week of October building the dam. Not a large one, just a low earthen berm at the narrowest point of the creek, packed tight with clay and reinforced with cut sod. The neighbors saw him working and stopped by his fence to ask what foolishness he was up to now. The oldest of them, a weathered Dane named Soren Lindstrom, stood with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders and shook his head slowly. "You dam that creek, you'll turn your field to a lake," he said. Kevin didn't look up. "That's the idea," he replied. Soren stared for a long moment, then turned and walked away without another word. By nightfall, half the homesteaders in the township had heard that Kevin Halleck had finally cracked. His wife, Anna, was harder to ignore. She had stood by him through the death of their daughter, through the brutal winters, through the back-breaking labor of breaking prairie sod. But when she saw the dam rising across the creek, she stood in the cabin doorway with their son Thomas, holding her skirt. "Kevin, you'll kill the wheat," she said quietly. Her voice wasn't angry, it was afraid. He set down the shovel and walked to her, put his cold hands on her shoulders. "The wind will kill it if I don't," he said. He didn't tell her about the cranberry bogs. He didn't know how to explain that the only way to save the wheat was to drown it first. So he just went back to work. By mid-October, the dam was finished. The wheat was beginning its slow slide into dormancy, the green fatting from the leaves. Kevin waited 4 more days, watching the temperature dip each night. Then, on a morning when the frost stayed white on the ground until past 10 o'clock, he opened the floodgate. Water spilled out of the creek channel and spread silently across the wheat field in a thin, silver sheet. It crept between the rows, covered the crowns of the plants, and kept rising. Within 2 hours, the entire 40 acres was under nearly 18 inches of water. The wheat had vanished beneath a shallow lake that reflected the pale gray sky. Kevin stood alone on the berm, watching his crop disappear, and felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. That night the temperature dropped hard. The water froze fast, a clear, thick ice that pinged and groaned as it thickened. By morning the field was a solid white sheet, smooth as glass. The wheat was sealed beneath it, invisible, suffocated, drowned. Or so it seemed. Kevin knelt at the edge and pressed his ear to the ice. He could hear nothing but the low groan of freezing water. He had no way of knowing if the plants were still alive down there, or if he had just committed the most expensive blunder in the township's history. The first test came sooner than expected. In early November, a hard wind blew out of the northwest for 2 days straight. It wasn't the black wind yet, but it was strong enough to rip hay from wagon tops and drive sand into men's eyes. Kevin stood by the field, bracing himself. The ice held. The wind scraped across that frozen slab and found nothing to tear. For the first time, Kevin allowed himself a breath of hope. Then he noticed the edge. Where the ice met the creek bank on the south side, the wind had carved a narrow gap. A sliver of dark water was exposed, and the wheat crowns near that gap were already showing signs of drying. The armor had a chink. If the black wind found that opening, it would peel the ice back like a scab and slaughter the crop in one night. Kevin had maybe a month to fix it before the real winter arrived, and he had no idea how. Kevin Halleck stood at the edge of his frozen field, staring at the dark sliver of open water where the wind had peeled back the ice. The gap was no wider than a man's hand, but it was a wound, and wounds like that on the prairie never healed on their own. The thermometer had already dropped to 5 below. In another week, the black wind would come screaming down from Canada, and if that opening remained, it would get its teeth into the ice and rip the whole sheet apart like wet paper. The wheat would be gone in an hour. Anna, his children, his dead daughter's grave behind the cabin, all of it would have been risked for nothing. So Kevin did the only thing he could think of. He refilled the water level. He opened the dam's small sluice gate a crack and let the creek trickle back into the field until the rising water closed the gap from beneath. The ice thickened again, but he knew it was temporary. The wind would find another opening. He needed something more permanent. He remembered how the cranberry growers back east dealt with ice fractures. They didn't just flood the bogs and walk away. Once the ice was set, they walked the perimeter every day, patching holes with slush, straw, even manure. Anything that would freeze into a plug. Kevin began walking the edge of his 40 acres each morning with a sled loaded with straw chaff and a bucket of wet clay from the creek bank. Wherever the ice looked thin or cracked, he packed the mixture in with his boot and let the freezing air weld it solid. 23 days. That was how long he had before the February black wind. Anna watched from the cabin window as her husband trudged across the white field, a small dark figure bent against the cold. She didn't understand. To her, the ice was a tombstone. She had watched him bury a healthy crop under water, and now he was walking on its grave trying to hold the stone in place. Thomas, their son, who was 7, asked one night if Papa was trying to make glass. Kevin smiled for the first time in weeks. "Better than glass," he said. "Stronger." But the neighbors were not smiling. Soren Lindstrom returned on the last Sunday of January, this time with 2 other homesteaders. They stood on the road and watched Kevin crawling on his hands and knees at the far end of the field, packing straw into a crack. Soren shook his head slowly. "He's farming ice," one of them muttered. "In Dakota, ice." They left without speaking to him. By that evening the story had spread. Kevin Halleck wasn't just a fool. He was a madman trying to grow wheat under a frozen lake. Then the first real cold descended. Not the black wind yet, but a deep, still cold that tightened the ice until it groaned like a living thing. Kevin woke in the night to a sound like a rifle shot. Another crack. He pulled on his coat and went out with a lantern. The ice had split in a jagged line, running nearly 30 feet from the creek bank into the center of the field. The gap was an inch wide, black water oozing up. He packed it with straw and poured creek water over it until it froze into a rough seam. But he knew he couldn't patrol the entire field every night. The ice was fracturing faster than he could repair it. What he needed was a way to make the ice more flexible. He remembered an old bog worker in Massachusetts telling him about mixing hay into the flood water. The hay froze into the ice and reinforced it, the way reeds strengthened frozen river crossings. Kevin didn't have hay. He had wheat stubble from the spring before, dry and brittle. But he also had a small patch of prairie grass he had cut for the milk cow. He spread armloads of it across the most vulnerable sections of the ice, then flooded again, sealing the grass into the frozen sheet. The result looked ugly, patchy, but it held. In those final days of January, he worked until his beard was rimed with frost and his fingers bled through his gloves. He rebuilt the dam twice, adding layers of packed clay and brush to keep the water level steady. He cut ice blocks from the pond on the far side of the creek and stacked them against the southern bank to break the wind's force before it hit the field. He created a low, jagged ice wall that he hoped would split the air currents, much like the idea that had haunted him since Massachusetts. The wind couldn't be stopped, but it could be fractured, broken, made tired. If he could just take the edge off that screaming February gale, the wheat might survive. Anna had stopped asking him to come inside. She simply left hot coffee in a tin pot on the porch. The wind and cold had become for Kevin what prayer was for her, a private negotiation with forces larger than human life. On the morning of February 3rd, the sky turned the color of old ash. The temperature plunged so fast that water thrown from a bucket froze before it hit the ground. Then the wind came. Not a gradual buildup, but a single, sustained blast that screamed across the open prairie and hit the cabin with the force of a train. Thomas cried out. Anna pulled him close. Kevin stood at the north window and watched the ice field through a blur of blowing snow. The black wind had arrived. For the next 3 hours, the world outside became a white void. Kevin could see nothing beyond 20 feet. The wind tore chunks of snow from the surface and flung them like broken glass. He heard the ice sheet grinding, a deep, continuous rumble that rose and fell with the gusts. He strained to see the dark gap where the south edge met the creek bank. If the wind found that opening, it would peel the entire slab loose. He had to check. He wrapped a rope around his waist, tied the other end to the porch post, and told Anna not to follow. The wind nearly ripped the door from his hands as he opened it. He crawled out onto the ice, hands and knees, feeling the surface shudder beneath him. The broken ice wall he'd built on the south side was already half buried in drifting snow, but it was working. The wind was hitting the jagged chunks and scattering, its force reduced before it reached the main sheet. Kevin crawled along the edge, searching for his repaired cracks. They were holding. The straw chaff seams had frozen into pale welts across the ice, rough but solid. The black wind howled overhead, but the ice held. Then he saw the new break. A split had formed parallel to the north bank, running from the dam nearly to the center of the field. Water was welling up and freezing instantly, but the slab on the far side was lifting slightly with each gust, flexing upward like a giant pane of glass about to shatter. If that slab broke free, the wind would get underneath and peel the entire ice sheet off the field in one catastrophic failure. The wheat would be torn out by the roots. Kevin didn't think. He crawled toward the split, dragging his axe. He reached the edge and saw black water gleaming beneath the rising slab. The only way to stop the lift was to pin the slab down. He drove the axe blade into the ice on the stable's side, then lay flat on the uplifted edge, using his own weight to press it back into the water. The wind screamed against his back. He felt the slab shudder and push against him, trying to rise. He pressed his face into the frozen surface and screamed into the ice until the gust passed. Then he scrambled forward, still lying flat, and forced the two edges together. He packed his gloves full of wet snow and crammed them into the crack. The cold water soaked through to his skin. He held the edges together for 2 full minutes while the wind died and rose again. At last, the crack sealed, fused by the instant freeze, but the wind wasn't done. Kevin crawled back toward the cabin, only to see a new danger: the dam. The surge of water from the lifted slab had pushed against the earthen berm, and a narrow stream of water was now escaping from a fresh gap near the sluice. If the dam failed, the entire pond would drain in an hour, leaving the wheat exposed and the ice sheet collapsed. He had to stop it now. He crawled to the dam, rope still dragging behind him, and began packing frozen clay and brush into the breach. His hands were numb clubs, his coat stiff with ice. He worked in near darkness as the wind and snow erased the world. Time dissolved. He stuffed everything he could reach into that hole: his own leather gloves, a woven hat from his belt, clods of frozen dirt. He used his boot to tamp it down. The water slowed. He held his body against the dam until the new plug froze solid. Then he collapsed in the snow and didn't move for a long time. When the last gust faded, the silence that followed was so deep it hurt. Kevin raised his head. The wind had stopped entirely, as if a door had been slammed shut. The ash-colored sky was clearing to a pale, brittle blue. He crawled onto the ice once more and saw what the storm had left behind. The entire field was covered in a thick, uneven blanket of snow. Not the thin, scouring snow of a normal prairie gale, but deep drifts that had accumulated behind his ice wall. The jagged barrier had caught the blowing snow and piled it over the ice sheet, building a soft white layer nearly 2 feet thick in places. Kevin scooped it with his hand. Beneath the snow, the ice was still solid. Beneath the ice, the wheat slept, sealed in a frozen tomb that had become a shield. The black wind had done more than fail. It had helped. It had delivered the one thing winter wheat needed most: a deep, insulating blanket of snow. The ice had become a snow trap, and the snow had become a fortress. For a long moment, Kevin just knelt in the quiet and breathed. He thought of Anna, of Thomas, of his daughter's small grave on the hill. The risk had not killed them. It had saved them, for now. But the dam was wounded. A thin crack ran through the compacted earth near the breach, and water still seeped through in a dark trickle. Spring thaw would turn that trickle into a flood. If the dam collapsed when the ice began to melt, the water would drain away too quickly, leaving the wheat exposed to the deadly freeze-thaw cycle of early spring. The armor would vanish just when the enemy changed shape. And that enemy, the false spring followed by a hard late freeze, was even more patient than the black wind. Kevin walked back to the cabin without looking back. Anna opened the door before he reached it. He stumbled inside, frozen and shaking, and she wrapped her arms around him without a word. The next morning, Soren Lindstrom rode up to the field. He had expected to find a cracked, empty pond and a dead crop beneath. Instead, he found Kevin calmly shoveling new slush from the dam leak into fresh patches on the ice, and the field buried under a thick snowpack that no other homestead in the township could match. The Dane stared at the drifts, the jagged ice wall, the reinforced dam, and for a long time he said nothing at all. Then he dismounted and walked toward Kevin with something slowly changing in his expression. Not approval, not yet, but something closer to unease. "You made the wind lay its own blanket," he finally said. Kevin rested both hands on the shovel handle. "Wind's got 2 jobs here," he said quietly. "Kill my wheat or cover it. I just showed it the better door." Soren looked again at the deep snow, then at the horizon. The black wind had returned to Canada. But the thaw was coming, and with it, the most dangerous season of all. The question no longer was whether the ice would hold. The question was whether the dam would fail first, and whether Kevin could fix a wound in the earth that ran deeper than any man could reach. The thaw arrived on the 4th of March, not with a gentle drip, but with a sudden warm wind that melted 6 inches of snow in a single afternoon. By sundown, water was running everywhere, carving dark channels through the drifts and hissing into the frozen earth. Kevin stood on the dam, watching the creek rise behind it, and felt the structure shudder beneath his boots. The crack near the sluice had widened. Dark water pulsed through the packed clay in a slow, steady rhythm, each surge carrying grains of soil away with it. He could hear the erosion happening inside the berm, a faint churning sound like something chewing its way out. If the dam collapsed now, the pond would drain in a violent rush, ripping the ice sheet off the field and carrying it downstream in a flood that would scour the wheat right out of the ground. Everything he had fought for would wash away in the space of a morning. Kevin didn't sleep that night. He hauled wheelbarrow loads of heavy blue clay from a deposit he had found a quarter-mile down the creek bank, mixing it with chopped straw and packing it into the breach by lantern light. His hands blistered inside wet gloves, then froze when the temperature dropped after midnight. Twice he slipped off the muddy slope into waist-deep water that stole his breath. Each time he dragged himself out, shaking, and kept working. Anna watched from the dark cabin window, knowing better than to call him in. She had seen this man before. He was not her husband right now. He was a body fighting a war against physics. By dawn, the leak had slowed to a seep. The clay held. Kevin slumped against the dam, chest heaving, and watched the first pale sunlight touch the ice field. The snow cover was thinning fast, revealing the dark, uneven sheet beneath. Patches of wheat stubble from the fall planting were visible now, sealed inside the ice like insects in amber, still green, still alive. He could see them clearly, and the sight pulled him back to his feet. But the dam was no longer the only threat. 2 days later, a stranger rode up the creek trail driving a buckboard. He was a lean man with a sun-blasted face and a heavy wool coat gone threadbare at the elbows. He stopped his team 50 yards from the dam and sat staring at the flooded field for a long time without speaking. Kevin was patching the ice again, spreading fresh straw over a thin spot near the north edge. He straightened up and waited. The man's name was Carl Hallgren. He homesteaded 12 miles downstream, where the same creek pooled into a shallow basin he used to water 40 head of cattle. His stock pond had been shrinking for weeks, he said. Now it was bone dry, not low, dry. For the first time in 6 years, his cows were drinking from a muddy hole he dug by hand, and the hole was filling slower than they could drink. He had followed the creek upstream looking for the cause. "You damned it," Hallgren said. "It was not a question. You damned the creek, and now my stock got no water." Kevin took a breath and let it out slow. "I built a pond, not a wall," he said. "Water still flows over the sluice. I only take enough to keep the field covered." "Your field," Hallgren repeated. He looked at the ice, at the dead-still winter wheat trapped beneath it, and his jaw tightened. "You're farming water. My cows are drinking dust. That don't square." The law on water rights in Dakota Territory in 1883 was a mess of custom and confusion. Most homesteaders followed the Old English rule of reasonable use. Whoever lived upstream could take what they needed, so long as they didn't ruin the supply for everyone else. But reasonable was a word that meant very different things to a man drowning 40 acres and a man with dying cattle. There was no water court to settle the dispute. There was only the neighbors, their guns, and their willingness to let a problem fester into violence. Kevin knew this. So did Hallgren. They stood on opposite sides of the dam, two men whose survival depended on the same thin ribbon of water, and neither of them could afford to lose. "I'll dig you a well," Kevin said finally. "I'll dig it myself, on your land, lined with stone. It won't run dry in summer." Hallgren stared at him. A well was weeks of back-breaking labor. The offer was serious, and they both knew it. "That don't fix my herd today," Hallgren said. "Nothing fixes anything today," Kevin replied. "Today we patch. Come spring, I'll make it right. You have my word." Hallgren didn't answer. He looked again at the ice, at the wheat frozen beneath it, and something flickered across his face that might have been doubt or might have been the first crack in his anger. He turned the buckboard around without another word and drove back down the trail. The matter was not settled, but it was, for the moment, paused. 2 weeks later, the ice began to fail. Not the dam this time, the sheet itself. A string of warm days in late March pushed the temperature into the 40s, and the ice started to rot from the edges inward. Large sections near the south bank turned milky and soft, then broke apart into slush that sank into the rising water beneath. Kevin watched it happen with a cold knot tightening in his stomach. If the ice melted too fast, the wheat would be exposed to the exact danger he had built the system to avoid: a late freeze. In Dakota Territory, April was crueler than February. The cold came back without warning, dropping temperatures 20 degrees in an hour, freezing the wet ground into a solid block that heaved roots out of the soil. Homesteaders called it the Black Snap. It killed more wheat than drought. A false spring would coax the wheat out of dormancy, send pale green shoots searching for the sun, and then the snap would come and turn the whole field to a frozen graveyard. The wheat under Kevin's ice had been kept in deep dormancy all winter. The ice was its clock, holding it in suspended sleep while the world above raged. But now the ice was melting and the wheat was waking up. Kevin could see the first faint green shoots pressing against the underside of the rotting sheet, seeking light. They were vulnerable. 5 days of warm sun and the plants would break through the ice entirely. 5 days after that, a single night of hard freeze would kill every stalk. Kevin needed to slow the melt. He needed more ice, but the creek pond was draining faster than he could replenish it, and Carl Hallgren was still waiting downstream with dwindling patience. So Kevin tried something he had never seen anyone attempt. He gathered the remaining snow from the shady north side of the barn, filled his sled with packed drifts, and spread the snow by hand across the thinning ice sheet. Snow was a blanket. It would insulate the ice from the sun, slow the melt, buy him maybe another week. He worked from dawn until dark, covering the most rotted sections with every handful of snow he could find. Thomas helped. The 7-year-old boy dragged a smaller sled piled with creek-bank snow, his small boots punching through the crust, his face bright with the serious importance of someone trusted with a vital task. He never asked what the snow was for. He just kept hauling. On the evening of April 2nd, the temperature soared into the mid-50s, and the ice melted into a shallow lake. The wheat was fully exposed now, standing 4 inches high and pale green beneath a setting sun. Kevin walked the field barefoot to feel the soil temperature. The ground was cold but soft. The wheat roots were thick and white, digging into the silt-rich mud that the flood had left behind. The plants looked healthy, better than healthy. They looked fed. And then, on the morning of April 5th, the black snap arrived. The mercury plunged to 6 degrees in 3 hours. The sky went hard and clear, a polished blue that offered no warmth. Kevin woke to a world turned to crystal. The shallow water on the field had frozen into a thin crust and the wheat stalks were sheathed in ice. He ran outside without his coat. The plants were glazed, stiff, frozen solid. The snap had come exactly on schedule and it had caught the wheat wide awake. For 5 minutes, Kevin just stood there, breath hanging in white clouds, unable to move. Every stalk he could see was locked in a frozen prison. He bent down and touched one. The ice cracked away from the leaf, and beneath it the tissue was still green. The glaze was on the outside. The plant itself, though cold, was not yet necrotic. The snap was fierce, but the soil was still releasing the stored cold of the ice sheet's winter, keeping the root zone just above lethal temperature. And the thin film of water that had frozen on the leaves had actually formed a protective seal, trapping a fraction of warmth. The very thing that looked like destruction was insulation. But it wouldn't be enough. The snap was forecast to last 3 days. If the ice glaze melted and refroze, cell walls would rupture. Kevin needed to keep the wheat coated until the danger passed. He needed to reflood the field completely, one more time, while the killing cold was still clawing at the air. He needed the ice armor back for a final stand. The sluice gate was frozen shut. The creek pond was at its lowest level since autumn. The dam was scarred and seeping. Downstream, Carl Hallgren's cattle were drinking from a shrinking mud hole. And now Kevin had to ask the creek for one more flood, knowing that the runoff would surge straight toward Hallgren's property with nothing to stop it. He sent Thomas running to the Hallgren place with a message. The boy took off through the frozen prairie grass at a dead sprint. Kevin didn't wait for an answer. He chopped the sluice gate free with his axe, wrenched it open, and let the water roar back into the field. The creek swelled, rose over the dam, and spilled into the icy basin in a dark wave. The wheat disappeared beneath the rising water. Within an hour, the entire 40 acres was a shallow lake once again, and the temperature was still falling. Kevin stood on the berm, watching the water spread, and a terrible calculation ran through his mind. If Hallgren didn't get the message, if he had moved his cattle into the low pasture this morning, the surge would drown half his herd in ice water. Kevin would be responsible. There would be no well deep enough or apology strong enough to fix that. The water kept rising. The freeze kept deepening. And somewhere downstream, a 7-year-old boy was running as fast as his legs could carry him toward a man whose land was about to flood. Carl Hallgren heard the boy, shouting before he saw him. Thomas came over the hill waving both arms, breathless, telling a wild story about a frozen field and a dam that had to be opened and water coming fast. Hallgren didn't wait for the end of it. He had already noticed the creek rising. He ran for the low pasture and found his cattle standing belly-deep in muddy water that had climbed faster than any thaw he had ever seen. The ice water surge was already pooling against the low berm he had built years ago to keep spring floods out of his hay meadow. If the berm broke, his entire winter hay supply would be ruined and the cattle would be stranded. Hallgren grabbed a shovel and waded into the freezing water. He cut a relief channel into the berm with a desperate energy he hadn't felt since the war. The water drained away into a natural coulee, sparing the hay meadow by inches. His cattle lowed and splashed, frightened but alive. By midday the surge had passed, the creek had stabilized, and Hallgren stood shin-deep in mud and ice, shaking with cold and fury, but also with something else he couldn't quite name. Back at the Halleck claim, the flood had already frozen. A clear, thin sheet of new ice sealed the wheat once more, protecting it from the black snap's second and third nights. The glazed stalks slept beneath their temporary armor. When the cold finally broke on April 8th, the ice melted gently into the soil, and the wheat emerged again, darker green now, thicker, the stems visibly stronger than they had been 4 days earlier. Kevin walked the rows in the warm sun, and what he saw in the mud nearly drove him to his knees. Earthworms. Dozens of them, fat and wriggling, turned up by the slow drainage of the flood. The rich silt from the creek had settled into the furrows, and the worms had come up with it, drawn by the steady moisture and the decaying straw. The soil was alive in a way no dry-farmed field had ever been. The flood had done more than protect the wheat. It had rebuilt the land. Carl Hallgren arrived the next afternoon. He rode up alone, his boots still caked with dried mud, and stood beside the dam. Kevin walked over slowly, ready for the fight he knew was coming. But Hallgren didn't swing. He didn't shout. He stared at the wheat, at the dark green field standing tall and clean in the April light, at the worm castings dotting the soil. Then he looked at Kevin with an expression that held no anger, only the grinding exhaustion of a man who had spent too many years losing. "You could have killed my herd," he said quietly. "Yes," Kevin said. "I sent my boy to warn you. I know that." Hallgren was silent for a long moment. Then he gestured at the field. "This is the second time you've drowned that wheat, and the second time it's come back stronger." "How?" Kevin almost said the word cranberries. But he stopped. He realized that what he was doing now, with the silt and the worms and the double flood, had gone far beyond anything those Massachusetts bogs had taught him. He had adapted the technique into something the cranberry growers would not have recognized. He had turned floodwater into a tool that didn't just shield plants but nourished them. And if it worked this well on wheat, it could work on other crops, on every dry-farmed field in Dakota Territory. He looked at Hallgren and said only, the ice wasn't just armor, it was a plow that never touched the ground. Hallgren didn't understand that yet, but he would. By harvest, the whole township would understand. The final freeze of spring passed without incident. The dam held through the remainder of April, leaking only enough to keep the creek flowing steadily downstream. Hallgren's stock pond refilled with the slow melt. The two men never became friends exactly, but a rough truce formed between them, sealed by shared survival and the unspoken knowledge that the coming harvest would prove who had been right all along. By mid-May, the Halleck wheat was waist-high, and so densely green it looked almost unnatural against the pale prairie. Travelers stopped their wagons to stare. Soren Lindstrom came back a third time, bringing a small notebook and asking detailed questions about water depth and ice thickness, and the precise timing of the floods. He was no longer mocking. He was copying everything down. And Kevin, standing in the middle of his miraculous field with the warm wind moving through the stalks, knew that the real story was just beginning. What he had done with ice in the winter of 1883 would not stay on this one claim. It would spread across the Dakota plains and change how men thought about water, cold, and the oldest fight in homesteading history, the fight against the wind. But first, the wheat had to be cut, and the numbers that came off those 40 acres would silence every doubt in the territory. Harvest came the last week of July, under a sky so blue it hurt the eyes. The wheat stood tall and heavy, the heads bent over with grain, a solid gold carpet that rippled in the warm wind. Kevin Halleck walked into the field with a sickle in his hand, the same sickle he had used every fall since filing his claim, and for a moment he just stood there, looking at the wheat and remembering the ice. Anna waited near the porch with Thomas and the baby, the new daughter born that spring, a child who had never known the black wind. The neighbors had gathered along the fence line too, not to mock this time, to see. Kevin cut the first sheaf by hand, tied it with a twist of straw, and held it up. The heads were fat, the kernels full and hard. He had never seen wheat like this, not on the prairie, not anywhere. He handed the sheaf to Thomas, who carried it to Anna like a holy object. Then Kevin started the real work with the hired crew he had scraped together, and the numbers began to pile up. By evening of the first day, they had cut 3 acres, and the shocks dotted the field like small cathedrals. By the end of the week, the 40 acres were down, and the thrashing crew arrived with a steam-powered separator that groaned and clattered across the stubble. The grain poured out in a continuous golden stream, filling sacks faster than the men could tie them. Kevin kept a tally on a plank of pine with a stub of charcoal, and when the last sack was weighed, he stared at the number for a long time without speaking. 53 bushels per acre. Not total, per acre. The average wheat yield in Dakota Territory that year was 16 bushels. The best fields in the county might hit 24. Kevin Halleck had tripled the best anyone had ever seen, and nearly quadrupled the average. 2,120 bushels off 40 acres of dry-farmed land that had been under a sheet of ice half the winter. The math was impossible, but the sacks were real. The news spread across Cannon Butte Basin faster than any prairie fire. By the next morning, wagons were rolling toward the Halleck claim from every direction. Homesteaders who had called Kevin a fool, who had shaken their heads and muttered about ice farming, now stood in his yard with hats in their hands, staring at the mountain of filled grain sacks beside the barn. Soren Lindstrom arrived with his notebook still open, and this time he wasn't copying. He was pleading. "Show me," the old Dane said. "Show me everything." And Kevin did. He walked them through the dam, the sluice gate, the ice wall. He explained the timing of the first flood, how the wheat had to be fully dormant before the water rose. He showed them the patchwork of straw and clay he had used to repair cracks. He told them about the black wind, how the jagged ice blocks broke the current, how the storm had unwittingly covered the field in insulating snow. He told them about the black snap and the desperate reflood that had saved the wheat a second time. He spoke for 3 hours while men scratched notes onto wagon boards and women listened from the shade of the porch with Anna, their faces unreadable. Carl Holgren came too. He arrived alone, dismounting the same buckskin mare he had ridden during the confrontation in March. His stock pond was full now, his cattle fat on spring grass. He stood at the back of the crowd and listened, and when Kevin finished, Holgren walked forward and did something no one expected. He stuck out his hand. "I'll take that well now," he said quietly. "But I won't dam your dam." Kevin shook it. The two men had never been friends and likely never would be, but they had been through a winter together, and that counted for more than friendship on the frontier. The harvest numbers held. When the grain elevator in town weighed the whole crop, the tally was confirmed and written into the county ledger. 53 bushels per acre, dryland winter wheat, Dakota Territory, 1883. A record that stood for 15 years. But the story didn't end with the harvest. Over the following winter, Kevin Halleck did something else that no prairie farmer had ever attempted. He sat down at his cabin table with sheets of brown paper and wrote out the complete method, every detail. The dam construction specifications, the depth of flood water required, the tolerance of dormant wheat to submersion, the critical temperature thresholds for ice formation, the repair techniques, the snow management, the silt deposit cycle. He wrote it all in a clear, methodical hand, and at the top of the first page he drew a diagram showing the creek, the dam, the field, and the ice sheet, with arrows indicating wind deflection. Then he rode to the Federal Land Office in Bismarck and filed for a patent. Not on the dam design, not on the ice wall, but on the method itself. He called it the Halleck ice armor cultivation process. The patent clerk read the application twice, frowned, and called his supervisor. No one in the Dakota Territory office had ever seen a patent for a farming method that used winter ice as a protective and nutrient delivery system. But the law allowed for novel and useful improvements in agriculture, and Kevin's documentation was immaculate. The patent was granted in the spring of 1885. Kevin Halleck, a homesteader with a fourth-grade education, now legally owned the rights to a technique that would eventually spread across the northern plains and into Canada. What Kevin had not yet fully understood, and what would become the final surprise of his discovery, was the hidden engine beneath the ice. For the first 2 years after the record harvest, he assumed the yield was solely the result of protecting the wheat from the black wind. But the soil kept changing. Each flood brought a fresh deposit of silt from the creek, and that silt was rich with decayed plant matter, finely ground minerals, and nitrogen fixed by the alder trees upstream. The worms multiplied. The soil grew darker each year, softer, deeper. Kevin was not just defending a field. He was building topsoil at a rate that normally took centuries. The ice armor had a second purpose he had never planned. It was not just a shield. It was a delivery system, taking the fertility of the creek bottom and spreading it across his wheat field inch by inch, year by year. The ice plow that never touched the ground was real, and it was more powerful than anything pulled by mules. Anna noticed it first. She was digging a garden near the cabin in the spring of '86 and pulled up a handful of soil that smelled like riverbank. "This isn't the same dirt we broke with the ox plow," she said. She was right. The Halleck claim now held some of the richest soil in the township, built by a process that no agricultural scientist had described before. The ice had become permanent armor, returning each winter to protect and enrich the land, as reliable as any hired hand. By 1890, the name Halleck Rings had been given to the method by farmers who adapted it for their own creeks. They built low dams and shallow basins, flooded dormant wheat in November, and watched the ice armor form. The technique never worked perfectly on every piece of land. Some creeks ran too fast, others too slow. Some soils drained wrong, but where it did work, yields doubled or tripled, and the black wind slowly lost its terror. The prairie itself began to change as more homesteaders planted shelter-belt trees alongside their ice fields, creating a patchwork of protected microclimates. What had started as one man's desperate gamble became the blueprint for a regional agricultural revolution. Kevin Halleck lived to see that revolution. He died in 1904 at the age of 59, still farming the same 40 acres. The dam had been rebuilt twice, reinforced with stone and cement. The creek still ran clear. The wheat still drowned each November and still rose each April, and the black wind still came every February, but it no longer found anything to kill on that claim. Thomas Halleck took over the farm. He was 28 years old, married with children of his own, and he had been hauling snow and packing clay cracks since he was 7. He knew the ice armor better than anyone except his father. And on the first winter after Kevin's death, Thomas walked out onto the frozen field alone, carrying his father's old axe, and checked the dam, the sluice, the drift lanes exactly as he had been taught. The ice held. The wheat slept. And somewhere downstream, Carl Hallgren's grandson was drawing water from the well that Kevin had dug by hand 20 years before. The patent never made Kevin rich. The legal fees and the cost of renewal ate whatever small royalties trickled in. But the patent did something more important. It time-stamped the idea, placed it in the public record as proof that a poor immigrant homesteader with no formal training could look at a frozen creek and see a weapon against the wind. The patent still exists, filed away in the National Archives, a yellowed sheet of paper with a hand-drawn diagram of a dam and a field and arrows showing wind shear. Anyone can look it up, and anyone who knows the story can see in those careful pencil marks the winter of 1882, the frozen wheat, the doubting neighbors, the daughter's grave, the night Kevin crawled onto the cracking ice with his own body weight holding the slab together, all of it captured in a single drawing. The surprising truth, the detail that even Kevin never fully articulated, was this. He had not defeated the black wind. He had not outsmarted the blizzard or conquered the cold. What he had done was more subtle and more permanent. He had looked at the most destructive force on the prairie and found a way to make it build what it was trying to destroy. The storm became the laborer. The wind stacked the snow that insulated the wheat. The freeze locked the silt into the soil. The thaw released it. Kevin Halleck never fought the winter. He partnered with it, and the partnership lasted long after he was gone. As for the cranberry bog workers in Massachusetts who first showed him ice armor, they never knew what their technique became. They never heard of Dakota or Cannon Butte Basin or the Halleck patent. They just kept flooding their bogs each December, same as they had for generations, growing fruit for tables in Boston and New York. But their idea traveled 2,000 miles in the mind of a weary farmhand, and when it arrived on the prairie, it changed everything. The last surprise waited until the spring of 1912, when the United States Department of Agriculture published a bulletin on winter wheat protection in the northern plains. The bulletin recommended a technique that sounded very much like the Halleck ice armor cultivation process, though it used different words. Farmers were advised to construct small retention ponds along creek beds, to flood dormant wheat fields after the first hard freeze, and to maintain an ice sheet through February. The bulletin cited recent studies showing a 40 to 60% increase in yield on flooded fields compared to dry-farmed controls. It did not mention Kevin Halleck by name. It did not need to. The idea had outgrown the man, as all truly powerful ideas eventually do. But in Cannon Butte Basin, the old stone markers of the original dam were still visible along the creek bed. The Halleck farmhouse still stood, surrounded by cedars that Thomas had planted in the pattern of his father's ice walls. And every February, when the black wind screamed south from Canada, the wheat on that land still slept beneath a sheet of ice that no gale could tear apart. The armor had become heritage. The gamble had become gospel. And the man who drowned his field on purpose was remembered, not as a fool, but as the homesteader who taught the storm to serve him. The story of Kevin Halleck asks us a question that still matters 130 years after he first dammed that creek. Not whether his technique worked. We know it did. The harvest records, the patent, the bulletin from the Department of Agriculture, all of it proves that flooding a dormant wheat field under ice armor can triple a yield. The question is deeper. How many other solutions are hiding inside the very things we've been taught to fear? The black wind was supposed to be death. Kevin saw it as unpaid labor. The ice was supposed to be a tomb. He made it a shield that built topsoil. What else have we misunderstood? Every winter across the northern plains, the wind still screams down from Canada. Farmers now use technology Kevin could not have dreamed of, but the principle he uncovered has never changed. Nature's most violent forces can be redirected, not by brute strength but by careful listening. A broken wind gets tired. A fractured current loses its killing shape. Kevin didn't fight the storm. He taught it a better way to move. And that might be the single most important lesson any homesteader ever left behind. Think about your own life for a moment. What's your black wind? What's the force you've been trying to block, to endure, to survive, when maybe the real answer is to open a small gate and let it flow into a pattern you design? Maybe it's not a storm. Maybe it's a difficult season, a fear, a memory. The ice armor principle works on more than wheat. Kevin Halleck was buried on the farm he built, beside the daughter who never saw the ice armor work, and the wife who believed him when he couldn't explain why. The cedars Thomas planted have grown tall now. The dam has been rebuilt by hands that never knew the first winter. But the question remains, do you think Kevin Halleck was truly brilliant? Or was he simply one of the few men willing to listen to what winter had been teaching all along? If stories like this remind you that the old ways still hold secrets we haven't finished learning, hit subscribe. We uncover one forgotten life every week, and the next one might change how you see your own.